An acute shortage of packaged milk has hit parts of Kenya, with some retailers capping the number of packets that are sold. In Nairobi, some supermarkets had completely run out of the commodity, while others were only stocking long-life milk. In Nyandarua County, retail outlets increased prices by about 10 shillings to between 60 and 70 shillings, depending on the packaging company. Similar price increase margin was also reported in Nairobi. Joining us to discuss further, climate change expert and also the CEO of CREIDE Group and also an ESG expert is, of course, Kathambi Kaari. Thank you so much, for joining us. Good afternoon to you over in Nairobi. What are the factors behind the milk shortage that we're seeing?
Right. Primarily, it has to do with drought. I think over the last couple of months, the region has seen low rainfall. And when you take into account that a large percentage of the dairy sector in Kenya is run by smallholder farmers, who account for about 80% of the informal milk market, you can see how the fact that there was a drought and low crop production and productivity has contributed to the low yields we are seeing in the dairy sector. That's the primary reason. But of course, other aspects, including inflation, including rising prices of power, mean that now you have the low capacity in terms of the milk that farmers are producing, but they're not able to provide enough milk to processors, who also actually are about 20% of the value addition market.
All right, great. So last time we had you on the show, we were talking about potatoes. So now we're talking milk. But I wanted to ask about Kiambu and Nyandarua. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Why are they, according to statistics, the best milk producers in the region?
Right. So these are areas in central Kenya, and typically because of their climate and where they sit in the country. In the highland areas, they are the more agriculturally productive parts of the country, and who actually supply the majority of produce to the country at large. But what is more important to note is that when these areas are now experiencing climate variability and climate change impacts, such as droughts, then we can start to sort of appreciate what is anticipated looking forward in terms of the impact of climate change and climate variability on food security and the ability for the continent to actually feed itself.
Great. In fact, the special we just played a few minutes ago was on climate change. So how do you address drought? Is it a helpless situation?
It's not completely helpless, and I think the first thing to understand is that given the nature of climate change and what the science-based predictions are, that we will continue to see these impacts of climate change, and so it's a question of how do we sort of manage and mitigate these climate risks, and specifically in terms of drought. We want to obviously make sure that we are transforming agriculture into in the continent into a more climate resilient sector that allows farmers to actually deal with the ongoing and anticipated impacts of climate change while still being resilient and productive. And so that entails a wide range of suits, including the sort of investments we make into the sector, how we engage farmers and communities in sort of going around climate resilient agricultural practices, water conservation, preserving ecosystems, sort of regenerative agricultural practices, and so on. But also it means that we need to keep enhancing productivity in the sector, because part of food security has to do with how productive the sector is. And so thinking about the value chain in totality, and what sort of policy and investments are required to make sure that the continent is actually, the country and the continent, which suffers many of these climate change impacts, is actually on the path to sustainable and efficient food production.
Great stuff. Now, you've mentioned a number of things here. What about the process needed to make farmers embrace climate resilient farming practices? How do you get around that?
Right. So effectively, you want to make sure that the policies that you have in place in the country and in the continent are supporting sustainable farming. What farmers need is obviously a lot of knowledge and information and capacity around what that looks like. You know, when we talk about the challenges that farmers face, we now start to think about what those challenges look in the context of climate resilient farming. And so a lot of it has to do with productivity, like I mentioned, has to do with value addition, infrastructure, and of course the sort of diversification that improves, I want to say that the sort of the agricultural land use and agricultural practices, right? So a sector like dairy, for example, doesn't lend itself very well to sustainable farming just because of the nature of methane emissions. And so when we think about climate resilient farming, then we also have to think about how we are using land for animal and crop production and in addition to, of course, building this other policy and underlying infrastructure to support productivity.
Great stuff. We only got a minute left. Can you tell us how we finance these practices?
Right. So I think that the most important thing is obviously for everybody to appreciate that the level of financing that is required to transform the agricultural sector across the continent is quite significant. And so we need to be thinking about financing at scale. And from that point, then we can start to see what sort of adjustments and improvements we need to make. And I think that it all begins with the efforts that the government makes around policy, around creating an enabling environment. And that looks like, good governance. It looks like de-risking sort of the risks that the capital markets and the private sector perceive when they think about engaging the continent. And that obviously requires quite significant knowledge, requires quite significant technical capacity to support these efforts by the government. And I think when you have that in place, then you sort of have a good base for other partners to kind of plug into the financing gaps, into innovating instruments that work for the specific sectors and all these other components that are required to sort of mobilize finance at scale.
All right. Kathambi Kaari in Kenya, thanks for talking to us about climate and how to improve those farming practices. We appreciate your insights as always.